top 20 Special Education Director Interview Questions and Answers. In this article, discover the most commonly asked interview questions during a Special Education Director interview. We have researched some great answers for these questions. Study and practice them to get adequately ready for your interview. 1. Can you briefly tell us about yourself? This is often the first question during most interviews. The interviewer wants to hear a summary of your qualifications, experience, skills, or qualities that relate to this position. Tip number 1, state your qualities, education attainment, and experience that are relevant to this job. Tip number 1, speak fluently and confidently to give a great first impression. Sample answer. I am a passionate, self-driven, and committed special education director. I hold a master's degree in special education. I have been a director of special education for 7 years. Over this period, I have worked in 2 special education schools where I have gained significant experience and knowledge in the field. Thus, I will perform this role effectively and as expected. 2. What is the role of special education directors? The interviewer seeks to test your familiarity with the role performed by a special education director. Tip number 1, mention the roles executed by special education directors. Tip number 2, prove that you understand the roles associated with this job. Sample answer. The role of a special education director includes planning, administering, and assessing the effectiveness of both short-term and long-term learning services for disabled children and other learners with special needs. The director plans and implements special education programs, creates budgets, and reviews legislation related to special education. He or she also ensures that special education schools have the resources needed to make learning effective. 3. What is your perspective about management? The interviewer seeks to understand your viewpoint regarding management to know the type of leader you are. Tip number 1, describe your viewpoint of management. Tip number 2, demonstrate that you are a great leader. Sample answer. I believe that any management position is created to get work done efficiently and effectively. This is achieved by distributing workload evenly to members of a team. Besides, managers should ensure that employees working under them have the resources they need to work productively. Effective management also involves stationing employees where they can perform best. 4. If one of your subordinates is performing inefficiently, what would you do? A good leader ensures that workers are performing effectively. The interviewer wants to assess the steps you can take to enhance the performance of your employees. Tip number 1, state how you would handle a case of underperformance. Tip number 2, prove that you can enhance employee productivity. Sample answer. As a responsible special education director, I consider people working under me as an extension of my effectiveness as a leader. Thus, I would find out issues that render the employee ineffective. Then, I will come up with solutions to the problem. For instance, I would develop a training program if the worker lacks the necessary skills. If the individual is affected by personal or family issues, I would offer relevant advice including recommending counseling. 5. As a special education director, how do you measure your success? Here, the interviewer wants to know whether you can set measurable targets. Tip number 1, mention how you measure success in your work. Tip number 2, show that you are successful in your work. Sample answer. I make sure to come up with a work plan that lays out tasks to be done, who should do it, and goals to be achieved. Then, I ensure to assign work accordingly. I also make sure that my subordinates have all the resources needed to achieve the desired outcome. In the end, I review what we have achieved against the set goals. This helps to determine the attained success. 6. How do you stay motivated in your work? The interviewer is interested in understanding how you remain inspired at work. Tip number 1, state what you do to stay motivated. Tip number 2, be precise and prove you are self-inspired. Sample answer. I am very passionate about what I do. I always feel satisfied when I achieve my goals. Moreover, I read about what other special education directors are doing, including the challenges they have overcome. Understanding how they tackled their challenges inspires me to press on and be optimistic that I will be successful. 7. How do you keep your team motivated? The interview manager wants to know ways you keep your subordinates motivated. Tip number 1, state what you do to keep your team inspired. Tip number 2, prove that you can maintain or improve productivity by inspiring employees. Sample answer. I acknowledge my team members whenever they achieve their goals or exceed their targets. During meeting with teachers or other workers, I recognize their contribution in ensuring that learning is taking place as planned. Besides, I offer prizes to the best performing employees. Using these strategies encourages everyone to increase their productivity. 8. Why is it important to use technology in special education? Here, your level of knowledge regarding the benefits of using technology in special education is tested. Tip number 1, show ways technology can enhance special education. Tip number 2, prove that you are positive about the use of technology in learning. Sample answer. There are many benefits of integrating technology in special education. Technology eliminates or reduces barriers for special education learners. It enables them to gain self-confidence, collaborates with classmates, keep up with other peers, and become more independent. Moreover, both students and teachers can access online learning resources such as ebooks and educational sites. 9. What is the most difficult situation you have experienced in your work and how did you tackle it? Here, the interviewer wants to assess your problem-solving skills. Tip number 1, describe a difficult situation you have encountered. Tip number 2, mention how you solved it. Sample answer. The most difficult situation I found myself in was working with uncooperative staff. I experienced this challenge last year. The employees had gone without pay for 2 months, so they were demotivated and very unsatisfied with the employer. I would assign work and many would not meet deadlines. I resolved this matter by letting the top management understand the chaotic situation I was going through. I kept on reminding them to sort out the financial issue. Also, I would encourage my team to be patient a little as they work. Luckily, the issue was solved in 2 weeks. 10. What qualities should a good special education director possess? The interview manager aims to know whether you are familiar with the qualities that can make you successful in this role. Tip number 1, mention qualities that special education directors should have. Tip number 2, be brief and direct with your response. Sample answer. To be effective and successful, a special education director should have good problem solving, team building, supervisory, and management skills. The director should be flexible, a confident leader, and have good listening and communication skills. Moreover, being highly organized, understanding, and well-developed decision-making skills are other important abilities. 11. Why would you advise teachers to consider having IEP meetings with students' parents? Here, the interviewer wants to know whether you understand the importance of individualized education program meetings. Tip number 1, mentions why you would recommend IEP meetings with parents. Tip number 2, demonstrate your understanding of the IEP concept. Sample answer. Holding IEP meetings with parents helps to keep them informed about the progress of their children. Moreover, parents get the chance to be a bigger part of their children's education. That way, they can help them achieve more academically. 12. How does a typical day of a special education director look like? By asking this question, the interview manager wants to know whether you are familiar with the daily routine of special education directors. Tip number 1, state at least 3 duties performed by special education directors every day. Tip number 2, be direct and don't mull over the answer. Sample answer. Duties performed by special education directors may vary based on their special education programs or country. But they typically create budgets, proposals, and new programs concerning special education, and direct personnel to offer services in line with established guidelines. They also evaluate special education programs, monitor how those programs are implemented, and facilitate processes and meetings for maintaining and implementing special education. Moreover, they prepare reports and documentation, address complaints, and supervise subordinates working under them. 13. What is your leadership style? The interviewer wants to assess your leadership skills and style. Tip number 1, state the style you use to lead others. Tip number 2, prove that you have good leadership skills. Sample answer. I lead by example and use a direct style of leadership. I uphold good conduct and professionalism so that my subordinates can emulate me. Also, I'm direct when it comes to pointing out issues and I like resolving them early on. 14. How do you implement change in special education? The interviewer aims to understand whether you can be trusted to implement change effectively. Tip number 1, demonstrate that you are skilled in implementing change. Tip number 2, provide a complete and convincing answer. Sample answer. I define the planned change and ensure it aligns with the goals of special education. I communicate the planned change and ensure everyone understands its impact. Then, change is implemented, effective training is conducted and necessary support is provided. Lastly, I assess the change process to determine whether the desired outcomes have been achieved. 15. In your opinion, which 3 skills are very important to a special education director? The interview manager wants to know the skills you consider as most vital to a special education director. Tip number 1, mention 3 skills that are essential for this role. Tip number 2, be precise and brief. Sample answer. Effective verbal and written communication skills, good problem-solving skills, and sound leadership skills are very essential in this role. A lack of any of these skills may render a special education director ineffective. 16. What strategy do you use to resolve conflict? This question is aimed at assessing your conflict resolution skills. Tip number 1, describe your conflict resolution mechanism. Tip number 2, prove that you have good conflict resolution abilities. Sample answer. First, I seek to understand the root cause of a conflict. This enables me to know what went wrong. Next, I think about an effective solution, and that involves fact-finding and identifying a common ground that both parties can settle on. Lastly, I communicate my solution and give facts in an attempt to engage the parties in resolving the matter. 17. How do you ensure the work you delegate is performed correctly? This question is asked to test how you delegate work and ensure it is performed as expected. Tip number 1, describe how you assign work. Tip number 2, prove that you are good at delegating work. Sample answer. Whenever I'm assigning work, I ensure that the people performing it are skilled and knowledgeable about it. I clarify all the detail and what is expected. I also make sure to provide all the resources needed to perform the job. Besides, I communicate the deadlines. 18. Why do you think you are the right candidate for this job? The interview manager wants to know how you match the requirements of this position. Tip number 1, state that you have the qualification, experience, and abilities they need. Tip number 2, prove that you have what it takes to execute this role effectively. Sample answer. My qualification and experience match the requirements for this job. I studied in one of the best universities in the country. I have worked as a special education director for 7 years. As such, I have significant experience in the profession. Besides, my passion for what I do and good communication, leadership, and problem-solving skills make me a good fit for this job? 19. Tell me a time you failed and what you learned. This question is asked to test whether you learn from your mistakes. Tip number 1, describe a failure you experienced. Tip number 2, mention what you learned from your failure. Sample answer. Some time back, I was away from the office, so I sent an email about some changes that needed to be effected on a particular program. But I forgot to include some key details. As a result, my team got confused, and endured hours of back and forth conversations. As a responsible leader, I called an emergency meeting shortly after arriving. I apologized and clarified about the changes. I learned to always cross-check my communications before forwarding them. 20. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? The interviewer wants to know whether your future ambitions align with the goals of the employer. Tip number 1, state what you intend to achieve in 5 years. Tip number 2, show your ability to plan and achieve your goals. Sample answer. In 5 years, I hope to gain more knowledge and experience through this position. Through that, I will be able to handle more work than I can now. I will also be able to handle more leadership responsibilities and deal with more complex challenges.